They mocked Eli Larson the moment he set foot on the farm, certain the thin stranger would crumble before the weight of a 900-pound elk. Brad, Cody, and Travis watched with smug certainty, eager to see him fail where they believed only brute force could win. But Eli had a way of turning the impossible into fact, 1 inch of rope and 1 step at a time. And just wait until you hear how this quiet outsider silenced their laughter and left only respect in its place. The small mountain town in Colorado had already begun its quiet descent into winter. Autumn's once golden light was fading behind a thick quilt of gray clouds, the sun little more than a pale memory on the horizon. A cold wind rolled down from the ridges, gathering dry oak leaves and sending them tumbling in restless spirals along the gravel road. The old barn sat at the edge of the property like a relic from another century, its boards weathered to silver, roof patched with sheets of tin that rattled when the gusts came strong. On the creaking porch, 3 men from the local farm crew leaned against the rail, boots scuffing the wood, their breath turning white in the chill. Brad, tall and broad-shouldered, spat into the dust with the casual precision of habit. Beside him stood Cody, wiry and restless, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of a grease-stained jacket. Travis, the youngest, kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his grin wide but watchful. They weren't looking at the mountains, or the road, or even the barn itself. Their attention was fixed on the lone figure making his way up the drive. He was thin, not the lean, wiry kind of thin earned from ranch work, but the kind that came from years indoors. His shoulders sloped forward under the weight of a worn, moth-bitten overcoat that hung too loosely on his frame. His steps were steady but unhurried, crunching over the gravel with a sound that seemed almost too soft for the setting. That was Eli Larson. Nobody in town knew much about him except that he'd arrived a few months back and kept mostly to himself. The talk in the feed store painted him as an odd sort, a man who'd once worked in a library, the kind who knew the weight of words but not of labor. Around here, that reputation meant something, and not in his favor. Brad's voice cut through the wind, carrying across the yard. "Hey, bookworm," he called, his tone light on the surface, but edged with mockery. "You sure you're up for this? Ain't like turning pages. This takes muscle." Eli didn't stop. He didn't answer either. He only gave a brief nod, his gaze fixed on what lay near the barn doors. A massive elk, its hide stiff with frost, taken down during the last hunt. 900 pounds, easy. Even with a team, moving it was work. Alone, it was near impossible. The men leaned in slightly as if settling in for a show. They expected the same thing. Eli would make the attempt, strain a little, maybe lose his footing, and then give up. Their smiles weren't friendly. They were the smiles of men waiting for proof of what they already believed. To them, Eli wasn't one of them. Not in strength, not in spirit. Out here, worth was measured in how much weight you could carry, not how quietly you could endure. And in that moment, the wind seemed to pause, as if the mountains themselves were waiting to see which way this was going to go. Eli stopped a few feet from the barn doors. Without a word, he slipped the worn overcoat from his shoulders and laid it neatly over the weathered fence rail. Beneath it, he wore a plain set of thermal long johns, faded and thinned from years of washing. In the sharp light, they clung just enough to show a frame that was lean, almost fragile. But the lines of his arms told a different story. They were narrow, yes, but sinewy. The kind of wiry muscle built not in gyms, but in long, quiet endurance. Across the pale skin ran faint, silvery scars, not fresh, but old enough to hold their own quiet history. He stepped to the elk, the frost still clinging to its hide. Kneeling beside it, Eli rested both hands on the animal's thick neck, fingers splayed across the coarse fur. He closed his eyes, his head dipping slightly, as if he were gathering something from deep within, strength, patience, or perhaps resolve. From the porch came a short burst of laughter. Cody, leaning against the rail, couldn't hold back. "Saying a prayer, Larson?" he called. "Maybe the elk will get up and walk in there for you." The chuckle died almost as quickly as it had begun. Eli exhaled slowly, the breath steaming in the cold air. Without looking up, he shifted his hands, found his grip, and began to lift, not in one quick motion, but in a measured, deliberate heave. The strain was immediate. His lips tightened, the color draining from them. His breathing grew ragged, each inhale shallow, each exhale drawn out. The tendons in his neck stood out sharply and his whole body seemed locked in a slow-motion struggle. The elk barely shifted at first. An inch, maybe less, but it was movement nonetheless. Inch by inch, he tried again, every fiber in his frame engaged against the impossible weight. A faint crunch of boots on gravel sounded from behind the fence. Martha, the widowed neighbor who lived half a mile down the road, had wandered up the lane, drawn by the commotion. She was small, bundled in a heavy wool coat, her silver hair tucked beneath a scarf. She stopped near the gate, her eyes narrowing in quiet concern. She knew. Everyone in town might trade stories, but she knew for certain. Eli had only just finished months of grueling rehabilitation after a serious injury. He wasn't supposed to test himself like this. Her voice lifted softly over the wind. Eli! But if he heard, he gave no sign. He didn't turn toward her, didn't even flinch at the lingering smirks from the porch. His whole focus was on the weight before him, as though the barn, the men, the onlookers, even the cold itself, had fallen away. At first, the whole thing looked like madness. 900 pounds of frozen elk lay sprawled in the dirt, the sheer size of it dwarfing the man who now stood over it. Brad shook his head almost imperceptibly, sure this was going to end in embarrassment. Cody smirked openly, already imagining how they'd retell the story at the diner later. Travis glanced between the two, caught somewhere between amusement and curiosity, but Eli didn't rush. He stepped aside, scanning the barn wall until his eyes landed on an old length of rope coiled on a nail. The fibers were worn, stiff from years of weather and work, but he took it down without hesitation. In one fluid motion, he crouched beside the elk, the rope in his hands, and began looping it around the heavy antlers. His fingers moved with the economy of someone who'd tied 1,000 knots in his life. Quick, deliberate, no wasted motion. When the rope was secured, he walked backward, feeling the slack draw out until it sang tight between his hands and the elk's head. Then he planted his boots deep into the frost-bitten earth. The ground crunched beneath him, small shards of ice breaking loose with each shift of weight. The first pull barely moved the carcass. A low scrape echoed across the yard, the sound of frozen hide dragging against unyielding dirt. He reset his grip, adjusted his stance, and leaned back harder. His arms flexed, the rope cutting into his palms. The elk slid forward by less than an inch, but the movement was there. Inch by inch, he began to make progress. The weight was relentless, but so was Eli. Every pull left a deep groove in the earth, the line behind him growing longer, darker, as the frost was torn away to reveal the raw soil underneath. From the porch came a faint chuckle from Cody. Look at him. It's like watching a mule try to move a mountain. But even as the words left his mouth, the laugh lacked the easy confidence it had minutes earlier. Brad's smirk was gone. He remembered trying to move that elk himself earlier that morning, just to see how far he could get it before the others showed up. After a couple of minutes, his back had burned. His grip had slipped, and he'd left it where it lay, muttering that 3 strong men would be needed. Yet here was Eli, this wiry stranger, dragging it alone. Eli's breathing grew ragged, every inhale sharp, every exhale hanging in the cold like steam from a kettle. His shoulders shook from the effort, the tendons in his forearms standing out in thin cords. The wind drove straight into his face, cold enough to sting the skin, but he didn't blink or falter. When his boots began to lose traction, he simply widened his stance, found a new hold in the earth, and kept moving. The minutes stretched. The elk crept forward, foot by foot, until it reached the halfway point across the yard. The men on the porch leaned in now, unconsciously mirroring one another, their postures no longer relaxed. Travis swallowed hard, his earlier grin gone, replaced by something closer to awe. Where once there had been easy contempt, a quiet shift had taken place. Surprise had begun to creep in, replacing the certainty of Eli's failure. And beneath that surprise, the first reluctant sparks of respect were starting to take hold. A respect born not from brute strength, but from the sheer, immovable will of a man who refused to stop. The antlers of the elk bumped softly against the wooden lip of the barn's threshold, the sound dull but final, like the closing note of a long, exhausting song. Eli stopped pulling. For a moment he stayed bent over, the rope slackening in his hands. His breath poured out of him in uneven bursts, each cloud of vapor drifting upward before being pulled apart by the wind. He planted one knee on the hard-packed dirt, letting his palm rest against it for balance. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened, the movement heavy with the kind of fatigue that sits deep in the bones. His chest rose and fell in short, careful breaths, not the desperate gasps of someone who had been beaten, but the measured breathing of a man who had reached his mark and refused to give anything away. The cold air stung at the tips of his ears. His shoulders hung with weariness, his hands trembling slightly from the hours of strain, and yet, in his eyes, there was no hint of surrender. They burned steady, a quiet ember that had endured the pull of rope, the drag of weight, the sting of wind, and the silent pressure of those who had been waiting for him to fail. From the porch, there was a shifting of boots, the sound of someone clearing their throat. Travis had taken off his cap, holding it loosely in both hands, his fingers working at the brim without thought. For a man usually quick with jokes, his voice now came out low, almost cautious, as if afraid to disturb the moment. "Man, how'd you do that?" Eli turned his head toward him. The faintest smile ghosted across his face, not mocking, not triumphant, but something grounded and real. "It's not always about being the strongest," he said, his voice steady. "Sometimes, it's just about not quitting." The words seemed to linger in the air longer than they should have, carried by the cold and the quiet. Nobody on the porch laughed. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to ease for a moment. Brad's gaze dropped to the ground. His jaw was set tight, not with anger, but with the weight of an unspoken realization. Something in him had shifted, a small fracture in the certainty he'd carried when Eli first stepped onto the yard. Out by the gate, Martha hadn't moved since the moment the elk crossed into the barn. She stood with her gloved hands folded over the top rail, her eyes warm in the fading light. The lines on her face deepened with a smile, not the broad, congratulatory kind, but the quiet smile of someone who understood what it cost a person to keep going when they had every reason to stop. She didn't clap or call out. She didn't need to. Eli stepped toward the fence, bent to retrieve his old overcoat and shook it free of the dust. The fabric was stiff from years of use, its color long since faded, but it carried the shape of his shoulders perfectly as he swung it back into place. Without another word, he turned and started down the narrow track that led away from the barn. His boots pressed into the frozen dirt, the sound crisp in the stillness. He didn't hurry, didn't look back. There was no need to check if they were still watching. He knew they were. The trail behind him told its own story. The deep groove carved into the yard, stretching from the gate to the barn, marked every inch of effort, every moment he had refused to stop pulling. The elk lay inside now, the job done, the impossible proven possible. And as Eli's figure grew smaller against the backdrop of the snow-dusted pines, he left more than the animal behind. He left the weight of the other's scorn, quietly replaced by something heavier, the respect of men who had never expected to give it.